The chateau slept under a slow golden sun, its ancient stone walls holding the day's heat and the whispered secrets of 100 harvests. In the deep cathedral cool of the barrel cellar, my husband Felipe moved with a sommelier's reverence, his flashlight beam caressing the dark oak like a priest checking on slumbering saints. He was a fifth-generation winemaker in Saint-Emilion, a man for whom time was not a linear march, but a circular, sacred dance measured in pruning, flowering, veraison, and harvest. His love was a grand cru structured, complex, built to age for a lifetime, its value increasing with each passing year in the silent dark. I was Claire, his American wife, the unexpected tender graft onto the ancient, gnarled vine. My official role was to manage the chateau's 4 luxurious guest suites and bring a flicker of modern, approachable life to the stone halls for our paying visitors. My unofficial purpose, I had come to believe, was to be a beautiful, quiet asset, maturing gracefully in the shadow of his monumental legacy, my own acidity softening, my own character blending seamlessly into his. Our love was a 2005, a legendary vintage, now resting in the perfect, unchanging dark. I mistook its profound stillness for depth, its elegant predictability for peace, its immense value for happiness. My secret transgression was a stash of cheap, brilliantly effervescent Prosecco in the very back of my office fridge, behind the bottles of mineral water and jars of house-made preserves. It was a guilty weekly pleasure I'd sip alone at my desk, its frivolous, pricking bubbles a delicious shock against the solemn, tannic weight of our life. It was my silent tribute to the immediate, the uncomplicated, the joyfully superficial everything our world was not. The spoilage, the foreign yeast that would infect my entire fermentation, arrived with the late spring rains and the sound of a dying engine. A bright blue Mercedes Sprinter van, ludicrously out of place between the stately, military straight rows of Merlot, coughed, sputtered, and wheezed to a final halt by the old stone trough near the tasting room. Felipe was in Bordeaux for 2 days, locked in tense negotiation with a powerful negociant. I was in the cutting garden, gathering sprigs of rosemary and lavender, the scent clean and melancholic in the damp air. The man who uncoiled himself from the driver's seat was a splash of chaotic color on a monochrome landscape. He wore a rumpled, paint-stained linen shirt, trousers that might have once been khaki, and a battered Panama hat shoved back on a head of unruly, sun-bleached curls. He had the sharp, intelligent, amused face of a fox and eyes the color of weathered slate after a storm changeable, depthless. He introduced himself as Luca, an artist, from Naples via Berlin, via Marrakesh. His van, his mobile studio, library, and home had finally given up its ghost. He needed a mechanic, a phone, and directions to the nearest, cheapest pension. "But this," he said, spreading his arms in a wide theatrical arc to take in the ordered rows of vines climbing the limestone slope. The stern, beautiful gray facade of the chateau, the timeless silence. "This is not cheap. This is a painting by a very skilled, very rich, and very boring old master. All technique, no heartbeat." I should have been offended. I should have offered a stiff, polite reply and directed him to the phone in the office. Instead, a laugh, startling and unfamiliar as a bird call in a library, burst from me. It felt like cracking ice on a frozen pond. "It's home," I said, the defense sounding weak even to my own ears. "Home," he repeated, tasting the word, rolling it around his mouth as if testing a dubious wine. "Sounds heavy, like a good mortgage, or a life sentence with a pleasant view. Or de fond en homme." He grinned, a flash of white in his stubbled face, and the sheer audacity of it was like a sunbeam breaking through cloud. I led him to the office in the former orangery, all light and pale stone. He followed not with a guest's polite restraint, but with the keen, scavenging curiosity of a magpie. His gaze drank in the formal portraits of severe ancestors, the antique, framed maps of the vineyard parcels, the dust motes dancing in the slanted sunbeams, as if they were the most fascinating ballet in the world. I called Jean-Luc, the mechanic in the village. He would be an hour, maybe 2. We drank coffee in the cobbled courtyard under the linden tree. He didn't ask about the wine, the land, the history, The market price per hectare. He asked about the light, how it changed on the limestone walls at 4 in the afternoon, what color the sky turned just before a harvest storm, if the profound velvet silence of the place ever made my ears ring. Philippe says the silence is the wine thinking, I offered, a line I'd heard him use with reverent visitors 100 times. Wine doesn't think, Luca scoffed, his grin both irreverent and brilliant. It just is. Like a sunset, like a heartbeat. You can analyze its chemical composition, its tannic structure, its bloody legs, or you can just drink it in, feel it. I prefer to drink, to feel. He took a loud, deliberate slurp of his coffee. Philippe spoke in precise, hallowed tasting notes. Bouquet of crushed blackberry, a hint of forest floor truffle, fine-grained, silky tannins, a finish of sweet tobacco. Luca spoke in raw, unfiltered sensations. The smell of wet earth after the first autumn rain, the feeling of sun on closed eyelids, the taste of a stolen, warm apricot straight from the tree, juice running down your chin. He was a vivid, messy, impressionistic watercolor next to Felipe's meticulously detailed, perfectly framed etching. He left an hour later with a wave and a shouted promise to send a thank you. The thank you arrived 2 days later, not in the post, but tucked under my empty coffee cup on the courtyard table. It was a postcard from one of his past exhibitions. One side showed a chaotic, beautiful explosion of color and texture titled Il Risveglio, The Awakening. The other side, in his rapid, slanted scrawl, read, For the woman who arranges flowers as if she's conducting a funeral. Life is not an arrangement. It's a wild, growing, dying, glorious mess. Let them run wild. L. That was the first foreign, untested yeast introduced into my sterile, controlled must. I didn't throw it away. I propped it against the neck of my hidden Prosecco bottle in the fridge, a tiny paper flag of rebellion in the cool, dark silence. He came back a week later, van repaired, with a thank you gift that was not a bottle of wine or a box of chocolates. It was a small, vibrant, stretched canvas. He presented it to me in the courtyard, his eyes watching mine with an artist's intense scrutiny. It was a wild, almost abstract impression of our chateau, but seen from a low, radical, worm's eye angle, as if from the perspective of a creature in the grass. The stones weren't dignified gray, but a riot of unexpected color. Lavender, ochre, cadmium yellow, a slash of Prussian blue for shadow. The sky was not a pale French blue, but a furious, joyful, swirling, Turner-esque yellow. How I see it, he said, his voice quiet now. Alive, on fire with light. Not a museum, not a tomb. Philippe, when he saw it later that evening, held it at arm's length, his head tilted. He gave a polite, slightly baffled frown. Interesting, a very emotional use of color. Rather agitated, don't you think? It doesn't look like home. It feels like home, I heard myself say, and the truth of it, shocking and subversive, vibrated deep in my bones. Luca was, as he put it, between inspirations, and the particular clear-seeing light of Saint-Emilion was unexpectedly persuasive. He rented a cheap north-facing garret above the boulangerie in the village. He began to appear, a splash of delightful chaos in my ordered days, as unpredictable and welcome as a sudden, warm breeze. He'd find me in the walled garden, pruning the David Austin roses with my expensive sharp shears. You hold those things like a surgeon about to operate, he'd say, sketching swiftly in a battered notebook. All precision, no passion. Do you ever just tear the blooms off? For the sheer destructive joy of it? To feel the stem snap? The first betrayal was not of the body, but of perception, of soul. I began to see my entire life through his riotous, subjective palette. The dignified, beautiful chateau began to look less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully appointed, gilded cage. The orderly, fruitful vines seemed not like a testament to care, but like silent, green regiments. The deep, respectful silence of our dinners, accompanied only by the soft clink of sterling on porcelain, and the occasional comment on the wine felt like the silence of a crypt. I was living inside a masterpiece of restrained classicist art, but every cell in my body was starting to crave the wild, emotional, honest strokes of the fauves. The second betrayal was geographical, a physical crossing from one territory to another. He asked me to show him the real terroir, not the cultivated vineyards, but the hidden, tangled forest that bordered the northern edge of our property, a place Philippe deemed unproductive, wild, and therefore unimportant, a mere buffer zone. I told Philippe I was driving to Libourne for new linens and guest amenities, a trip that would take most of the afternoon. The lie was a thin, serviceable cotton sheet thrown over a gaping, dangerous hole. The forest was a different world. It was a moist, shadowy tangle of life and violent decay, smelling of damp humus, mushrooms, and cold stone. Luca didn't walk the faint paths. He prowled, his artist's eyes missing nothing. He pointed out the grotesque, beautiful architecture of a shelf fungus, the violent, luminous green of moss devouring a rotting log, the way the low afternoon light fractured through the dense canopy into 1,000 shifting, dappled pieces on the forest floor. This, he said, his voice hushed not with reverence for tradition, but with awe for the actual. This is the truth, the messy, beautiful, dying, living, rotting truth. Your vineyards out there are a beautiful lie of control. This is what happens when no one is looking. This is real. He kissed me there, against the rough, damp bark of an ancient oak that had been a sapling when the chateau's foundations were laid. It was not a kiss of reverence, legacy, or even gentle affection. It was a hungry, devouring, claiming kiss, full of the taste of wild garlic from his lunch and a thrilling, electric sense of transgression. It was a kiss that said, I see the wildness in you, and I want it. We made love on a spongy bed of moss and leaf litter, and it was nothing like the careful, considerate, almost ritualistic couplings in our vast, canopied bed with its ironed linen sheets. It was frantic, earthy, clumsy, a merging of two creatures in the wild, driven by a pulse that felt more ancient than any notion of legacy. I felt in those chaotic minutes not like a chateau's mistress, a keeper of traditions, but like an animal, glorious, free, and utterly base. Afterwards, I shook from cold, from adrenaline, from a seismic shock to my very identity. He wrapped his paint-smudged linen shirt around my shoulders. It's just the shock of being real, he murmured, brushing a curled brown leaf from my tangled hair. You've been in storage, in the perfect dark, for too long. You needed air. You needed to breathe, even if the air is cold. He framed my guilt not as a moral failing, but as a necessary racking, a clearing of the sediment so the true flavor could emerge. In my disoriented state, I clutched at that narrative like a life raft. Thus began my double life, a treacherous, exhilarating double fermentation. By day, I was Claire de Valois, the chateau's elegant, composed chatelaine, presiding over wine tastings and historical tours for wealthy Americans, speaking in hushed, knowledgeable tones about vintages and terroir and malolactic conversion. By night, or in stolen, golden afternoon hours, I was just Claire, a wild, secret muss fermenting violently in a hidden, makeshift vat, full of unpredictable, volatile gases and the thrilling promise of a disastrous, glorious explosion. I kept two sets of books, the official, leather-bound Chateau Ledger, guest reservations, inventory lists, maintenance schedules for the pool, notes on which visitors preferred which vintage, the secret, spiral-bound sketchpad hidden behind a row of leather-clad wine manuals on my office shelf, hurried, guilty drawings of his hands, the scrawled address of his garret, dates and times of meetings coded as market research in Bergerac or florist consultation in Saint-Emilion. The logistics of this deceit required the cunning of a smuggler and the steady nerves of a bomb disposal expert. I kept a set of town clothes, simple jeans, a plain black t-shirt, a worn leather jacket, in a tote bag at the bottom of the linen closet in a disused guest room. I acquired a cheap pay-as-you-go mobile phone, a burner he called it with a painter's relish for the gritty, cinematic term, and kept it switched off and sealed in a Ziploc bag, tucked inside a hollowed-out, dusty volume on 19th century vineyard pests. I became a virtuoso of plausible, boring alibis. weaving just enough truth into the fabric to make it hold. Visiting a new artisan pottery for unique guest dinnerware. Attending a French-language cinema club in Bergerac to improve my idiom. Long walks to photograph the changing light on the vines for our website and social media. Philippe, whose trust in me was as deep, unchallenged, and fundamental as the limestone beneath our feet, accepted it all. His world was governed by the slow, visible, scientific poetry of phenology, the bud break, the flowering, the veraison, the clandestine, emotional chemistry of deceit, the souring of the must, was an invisible process, one his empirical mind could not conceive of until it was too late. His concern, when expressed, was always practical, grounded. "Don't exhaust yourself with all these errands, chérie," he'd say, looking up from his soil analysis reports. "The guests will always be there. You are more important than any new linen or photograph. Preserve your energy." The guilt was a volatile acidity, eating away at my insides, a sourness I could taste at the back of my throat during the quietest moments. It would spike with agonizing intensity during Felipe's acts of profound, traditional, unassuming love. When he presented me, on a mundane Tuesday evening, with a necklace of antique, pear-cut diamonds that had belonged to his formidable great-grandmother, Matilda, a symbol of continuity and acceptance into the lineage. When he secretly commissioned a stone mason to carve a bench with both our names and the dates of our marriage, placing it under the shade of the oldest, most gnarled vine on the property, a spot he called the heart of the terroir. When he talked about our future, about the child we had been softly, hopefully trying for, who would be the sixth generation, the living, breathing continuation of the blend, the ultimate reason for all the silent, patient work. "Our legacy, Claire, is not just in the bottle," he'd say, his hands steady and sure and stained faintly at the cuticles from vineyard work, resting on my still flat stomach. "It is in the blood, in the land, in the name. It is something that grows." His love was the patient élevage, the nurturing in oak and the waiting in bottle. My betrayal was the cork taint, the unseen invasive fungus of Brettanomyces that ruined everything it touched with the smell of wet leather and decay, a flaw no amount of aging could fix. To manage the unbearable cognitive dissonance, to try to bridge the chasm between the woman I was with, Philippa, and the creature I was with, Luca, I began to subtly, perhaps unconsciously, sabotage my own pristine domain. I'd forget to order the specific fragrant lilies for the blue suite, which housed a regular, important guest from Zurich. I'd play obscure modern jazz through the hidden speakers in the formal salons during the empty afternoons, its syncopated, discordant rhythms an intentional affront to the classical silence. I was trying to cultivate an air of distracted, artistic incompetence, to weave a narrative of a woman becoming slightly unspooled by the pressures of hospitality, so that when the final, catastrophic rupture came, it might seem like a tragic but understandable collapse, not a cold, calculated, targeted demolition. Luca's world was one of glorious, intentional mess. He lived on sporadic sales, the occasional grant, and the sheer magnetic force of his charm. He showed me his current work in his garret not pretty, saleable landscapes of the Dordogne Valley, but frenzied, emotional portraits where faces seemed to be melting or emerging from the canvas, and still lifes where overripe fruit looked violently erotic, about to burst or rot. He loved me with the passionate, all-consuming intensity of a man who has found a new, electrifying muse. But his studio was a temporary setup, his garret a month-to-month lease, his van always packed and ready to go. With him, I felt seen, not as a châtelaine or a future mother of a dynasty, but as a burst of conflicting color, a collection of intriguing shadows, a fascinating, sensual texture. With Philippe, I was seen as part of a beautiful, enduring composition, a figure in a centuries-old family portrait. My position and value clear and fixed. Philippe, the master of detecting the slightest flaw in a barrel, the faintest hint of volatile acidity or reduction in a sample, began to sense the off note in the air of our life. Not evidence, he was not a detective, but a subtle whirring shift in the bouquet. My new thinly veiled impatience during the protracted solemn tastings with importers. the unfamiliar astringent scent of turpentine and linseed oil that sometimes clung to my skin or hair. A scent no pottery visit or flower market could explain. The way I'd gaze out of the mullioned windows at the timeless, rolling vineyard, with an expression not of proud ownership, but of a restless, trapped longing, as if watching a beautiful tide that never came in. "Your palate seems troubled lately, Claire," he said one evening, uncharacteristically blunt, as we sampled a promising 2018 from a new oak barrel. He used the professional term, his brow furrowed not in anger, but in genuine enological concern. "Agitated, imprecise, as if you're tasting something else entirely, something that is distracting you from the wine in your glass. Is it the stress of the season? Or perhaps," he paused, choosing his words with the care he used to select a blending wine, "that Italian artist's influence? His vision is so unstable, subjective, like a wine that refuses to clarify, that won't settle. It can spoil the taste for everything else." It was a quiet, devastatingly accurate warning, couched in the only language he truly trusted. He had not only identified the source of the contamination, but had diagnosed its effect on my very perception. The crisis, when it came, was precipitated not by a careless lie or a seen text, but by a gift. Luca, in a moment of sentimental, possessive bravado, gave me a painting. Not a sketch, not a postcard, but a small, intense, stretched canvas. He presented it to me in his garret, the air thick with the smell of oil paint and stale coffee. It was a portrait of me, but not as I was, not as Philippe or the guests or the village saw me. In this painting, my hair was a wild, Medusa-like storm of Prussian blue and burnt sienna streaks. My eyes were dark, smoldering pools, not of calm, but of some unnameable hunger. My lips were parted, not in a smile, but as if caught in the act of a shout, a song, or a scream. He had titled it, in his slanted cursive on the backstretcher, La Femme Réveillée. The woman awakened. It was a raw, beautiful, terrifying piece of evidence, a naked declaration of how he saw me, and worse, how he had made me see myself. "It's you," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "The you that was sleeping in that beautiful stone tomb. This is the truth." I was horrified and elated in equal measure. I hid it in a rarely used wardrobe in my office, behind a stack of heavy winter blankets, as if burying a body. But its psychic energy, its violent claim, felt like a constant, low-frequency shout in the silent, orderly house. Weeks later, Philippe was deep in preparation for the premiere tastings, the most critical commercial week of the year, where critics and buyers would sample the young, unfinished wines from barrel. The atmosphere was one of controlled, sacred panic. He needed a specific set of antique, paper-thin, Riedel tasting glasses, stored in a high, seldom-accessed cupboard in my office for safekeeping. I was at the village market, tasked with sourcing enough local foie gras and cheese to feed 50 discerning palates. He fetched the old wooden stepladder from the cellar. He found the painting. He must have been searching for something else, a box of spare crystal stems perhaps, and moved the tower of blankets. The small, vibrant canvas would have shrieked its presence in the monochrome, ordered room. I returned, my arms aching from market bags, to find him standing in the exact center of my office. He was utterly motionless. The painting was in his hands. He wasn't looking at the wild colors, the frenzied brushstrokes, my transformed face. He was staring through it, his own face the color and texture of cold ash. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire prized cellar, his legacy, his 2005s and 2010s and 2015s, turn to vinegar in an instant, a financial and spiritual ruin, complete and irredeemable. He heard my intake of breath and looked up. His eyes, usually the warm, placid brown of well-aged oak, held a devastation so complete it was beyond tears, beyond anger. It was a hollowing out. "Who?" he asked, his voice a dry, ancient whisper, the sound of dust settling in an empty, abandoned barrel. "Has been painting my wife?" The question was perfect, and it shattered the last of me. He didn't ask about sex, about lies, about another man. He asked about the gaze, the interpretation, the fundamental reimagining. He understood that another artist had entered the private gallery of his life, had taken his most cherished portrait, the portrait of me as his wife, as the Chatelaine, as the future, and had painted over it, violently and without permission, revealing a chaotic, hidden underpainting he never knew existed and never ever wished to see. There was no blending this away, no careful addition of a stabilizing wine to correct the flaw. The evidence was a brutal, irreconcilable clash of visions, of realities. Standing there in the room where I had politely, efficiently managed the business of our life, I confessed. I gave him the unvarnished, ugly cuvée of my deceit. Luca, the forest, the garret, the frantic, earthy couplings that felt like life, but were in fact a kind of death. The hidden phone, the secret sketches, the Prosecco in the fridge, the postcard flag of rebellion. I laid out every unstable, dishonest ingredient. As I spoke in a dull, flat monotone, I watched the grand, dignified, centuries-old edifice of his world, a world built on lineage, patience, discipline, and the slow, glorious accumulation of value crumble, like old, dry mortar under a hammer. His face moved through the ontological stages of disaster, the initial paralyzing shock of the first, alien, horrifying sip, the grimace of profound, physical rejection as the flawed taste registered, the final, blank, helpless swallow of a ruined finish, knowing nothing could ever remove that taste from memory. When my voice finally cracked and failed into silence, he didn't speak for a long minute. Then with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cost him immense effort, he walked to the large cold fireplace that had never in my time held a fire. He placed a small canvas carefully on the bare iron grate. He took a long match from the porcelain holder on the mantel, struck it with a sharp, definitive scritch, and held the flame to one corner of La Femme Réveillée. We both watched as Luca's vision of me, the awakened woman, the wild creature, curled, blackened, and dissolved into smoke and fragile gray ash. I have dedicated my entire life, he said, not looking at me, speaking to the dying embers, his voice regaining a terrible flat calm, to the slow, humble alchemy of time, to guiding something fragile and potential through darkness and careful attention into a state of perfect, balanced maturity. It is a pact with patience, a rejection of the immediate. He finally turned. The look in his eyes was empty, like a priceless bottle drained to the bitter lees. You, Claire, you were not the vintage I believed you were. You were a grape that wanted only to be eaten in the sun, immediately, juicy and sweet and transient. I was a winemaker. You were a picnicker. He shook his head, a final definitive movement that seemed to sever an invisible cord. We cannot share a cellar. Our preferred climates are incompatible. One will always spoil the other. He left that night. His packing was a swift, somber, devastatingly selective process. He took his grandfather's silver tasting cup, his worn, leather-bound carnet de vin, with every harvest note for 30 years, the simple silver-framed photograph of us on our wedding day on the steps of the village church. My hair in a neat chignon, his hand on mine. He left everything else, the chateau, the vineyards, the barrels, the library of vintages, every stone and vine and bottle of our shared potential legacy. At the heavy oak front door, under the stone arch that bore his family's crest, he paused, a single elegant leather valise in his hand. I don't want any of it, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast silent hall. The terroir is compromised. The appellation is ruined. The land has lost its truth for me. The aftermath was a long, sterile, and brutally efficient filtration. Philippe communicated only through Maître Baudin, a venerable, unsmiling lawyer from a Bordeaux firm older than the chateau itself. The divorce was a precise, equitable, and chillingly impersonal division of assets. He was brutally, scrupulously, honorably fair, which felt like the most contemptuous form of punishment imaginable. My family, who had seen in Philippe the very embodiment of European stability, culture, and enduring value, were aghast. My father, a pragmatic Boston financial planner, could barely look at me during our one, strained phone call. You had a first-growth life, Claire, A literal premier cru, an appreciating asset, and you traded it for what? For a garret? For a messy sketch? It's not just a betrayal, it's a catastrophic failure of judgment. When the autumn mists began to rise, like ghosts from the Dordogne each morning, painting the vineyards in soft, mournful gray, I went to the village. The garret above the boulangerie was empty, scrubbed clean, anonymous. The landlady, Madame Clément, recognized me and gave a sad, knowing shrug. The Italian? He left. 2 weeks ago. Paid in full, no fuss. Said the light here had changed. That it had grown cold. He was heading south, I think. To Spain. For the hotter colors, he said. She touched my arm briefly, a gesture of pity that scalded more than any accusation. Courage, madame. The vibrant, immediate, life-in-the-moment passion I had craved, the fermentation I had mistaken for true vitality, was, by its very nature, migratory. It followed the light, the new inspiration, the next intense sensation. I had been a compelling local hue, a unique, intriguing shade of gray he had momentarily transformed into gold. But the artist's eye, forever restless, was already searching the horizon for the next spectrum, the next explosion of color. I could not stay at the chateau. The silence of the cellars, once a place of peaceful potential, was now a mocking echo of my own profound emptiness. The perfectly ordered vines were a living indictment of my chaos. I sold my share, at a significant discount, to a distant, ambitious cousin of Philippe's, who saw only the land, not the ghosts. With the money, I moved to a small, modern, characterless apartment in Lyon, a bustling city with no vineyards, no stone ghosts, no memories in the limestone. I took a job as a junior copywriter for a sleek advertising agency, my world reduced to manufacturing desire, to selling things perfume, cars, holidays, with words that promised transformation, joy, and authenticity, but delivered only a temporary hollow satisfaction. I live in a state of perpetual, blank present tense now. The silence here is not the deep, fungal, pregnant silence of the cellar, but the dead, vacuum-sealed quiet of a soundproofed room. Sometimes in a crowded bistro, I will catch myself staring at the wine in my glass, watching the legs or tears slide slowly down the side, and a loss so profound it feels like a physical, unquenchable thirst will grip my throat. I sought to trade a life of profound, aging, layered complexity for the thrilling, simple, immediate pop of an uncorked, effervescent now. But I was not a joyful, drink-now wine. I was, it turned out, a grand cru who committed an act of spectacular, stupid autodestruction. And now I am left with nothing but the haunting memory of a bouquet I was too impatient to appreciate, the ghost of tannins that once promised structure, and a mouth that feels forever permanently dry with the dust of regret.